The night sky over Meridian Station burned with the trails of distant warfare as Commander Jake Morrison led his strike team through the canyon pass. His squad moved in silence, their boots crunching softly on the red sand. The Ashen Vale convoy was exactly where intelligence said it would be, winding through the narrow valley like a glowing serpent. Jake raised his fist, and his team froze. Through his scanner, he counted 6 transport vehicles, heavily armored but lightly guarded. The Ashen Vale had grown arrogant after 5 years of war. They believed humanity was on the verge of collapse. Lieutenant Maya Brooks crouched beside him and whispered into her comm, asking if they should proceed. Jake nodded once. This was a supply run, probably weapons or ammunition. Anything they could steal or destroy would help their desperate defensive efforts. The attack was swift and brutal. Plasma charges disabled the lead and rear vehicles, trapping the convoy. Human soldiers poured from the rocks, their weapons finding targets before the Ashen Vale guards could react. Within minutes, it was over. But something was wrong. Jake stood in the center of the convoy, staring at the cargo containers. These were not weapons shipments. The containers were reinforced prison cells. Maya pried open the first container and gasped. Inside was an Ashen Vale woman, but unlike any Jake had ever seen. Most Ashen Vale wore elaborate armor and looked at humans with cold contempt. This one was chained to the wall, her silver hair matted with blood, her elegant robes torn and stained. Her violet eyes locked onto Jake with an intensity that made him step back. But it was the second container that made his blood run cold. Inside lay a dragon, its scales the color of dying embers, its breath coming in ragged gasps. A massive wound across its side leaked silvery blood. The creature was easily 20 feet long, even in its cramped prison, and Jake knew from briefings that dragons were the most sacred beings in Ashen Vale culture. The woman spoke, her voice hoarse but commanding. She said something in her own language, then switched to heavily accented human speech. She demanded they kill her and her dragon quickly if they had any honor. Jake ignored her and turned to Maya. He ordered her to get medical supplies immediately. Maya stared at him in disbelief and reminded him that these were enemy combatants, that treating them was against protocol. That command would have them both court-martialed. Jake repeated his order, his voice leaving no room for argument. Maya hesitated, then ran to get her medical kit. The Ashen Vale woman watched this exchange with narrowed eyes. She asked Jake why he would waste resources on those who would see him dead. Jake did not answer. He was already climbing into the dragon's container, his hands gentle as he examined the wound. The dragon's eye opened, a brilliant gold that fixed on Jake. For a moment, he thought the creature would incinerate him with its legendary fire breath. Instead, it simply watched as Jake began cleaning the wound with supplies Maya brought. They worked through the night. Maya was a skilled medic, and under Jake's orders, she treated both the woman and the dragon. The Ashen Vale prisoner said nothing during this time, but her eyes never left Jake. When he personally stitched the worst of the dragon's injuries, murmuring reassurances to the creature like it was a wounded soldier, something shifted in her expression. As dawn broke over the canyon, Jake finally spoke to her. He told her she and her dragon were now prisoners of war and would be taken to the human carrier Valiant Dawn. He promised they would not be harmed. The woman studied him for a long moment before responding. She introduced herself as Lady Seraphine Vel Ashara of the First Blood, commander of the 7th Fleet, daughter of House Ashara. She said her dragon was named Emberwing and that by the laws of her people they should both be dead. Jake asked why they were prisoners. Seraphine smiled bitterly and replied that she had committed the worst crime imaginable in the Dominion. She had told the truth. Before Jake could question her further, his comm crackled with urgent warnings. Ashen Vale scouts had detected the attack and reinforcements were incoming. They had to move now. The evacuation was chaotic. Emberwing was too large and too injured to fly, so they had to rig a transport sled. Seraphine refused to be separated from her dragon and insisted on walking beside the sled despite her own injuries. Jake found himself admiring her stubbornness. As they reached the extraction point, Ashenvale aircraft appeared on the horizon. Jake's team formed a defensive perimeter while their transport ship descended through enemy fire. Plasma bolts lit up the dawn, and Jake lost 2 good soldiers covering the retreat. They made it aboard with seconds to spare. As the transport climbed toward orbit, Jake watched Seraphine through the window of the medical bay. She sat beside Emberwing, her hand on the dragon's scales, singing something in her own language. It sounded like a lullaby. Maya approached Jake and asked him what he had gotten them into. Jake admitted he did not know, but something about this situation felt important. The Ashenvale did not take prisoners. They certainly did not transport their own nobles in chains, and they definitely did not wound sacred dragons. Maya pointed out that Seraphine claimed to be high nobility, that her house name appeared in their intelligence files as one of the 3 founding families of the Ashenvale Dominion. If that was true, they had just captured someone incredibly valuable. Jake nodded slowly. But he was thinking about something else. He was thinking about the way Seraphine had looked at him when he chose to save Emberwing. Not with the contempt he expected from an Ashenvale, not with the cold calculation of a prisoner planning escape. She had looked at him with something like hope. The transport docked with Valiant Dawn an hour later. Admiral Kate Stevens was waiting in the hangar bay, her face stern. She demanded an explanation for why Jake had returned with enemy prisoners instead of enemy supplies. Jake gave his report, keeping his voice professional. He explained what they had found and his decision to capture rather than kill. He emphasized that Lady Seraphine might have intelligence value. Admiral Stevens listened in silence, then ordered the prisoners secured in the detention level. She told Jake they would discuss his unauthorized actions later. As guards moved to take Seraphine away, the Ashenvale woman turned back to look at Jake one last time. She spoke softly, her words almost lost in the noise of the hangar. She thanked him for Emberwing's life and said that humans were not what she had been taught to expect. Then the guards led her away, and Jake was left wondering what exactly he had unleashed. That night, as Jake lay in his bunk unable to sleep, his comm chimed. It was a message from the detention level. Emberwing was restless, and the guards were worried the dragon might damage the reinforced cell in its agitation. They requested Jake's presence since the creature had responded to him before. Jake found himself walking through the dim corridors of the ship toward the detention level. He told himself it was just to calm the dragon, to prevent a security incident, but he knew he was lying to himself. He wanted to talk to Seraphine again. He wanted to know what truth she had told that made her own people try to execute her. When he entered the detention area, he found Seraphine sitting against the transparent wall separating her from Emberwing's larger cell. The dragon's head was pressed against the barrier from the other side, and she was singing that same lullaby from before. She looked up as Jake approached but did not stop singing. Her voice was hauntingly beautiful. When the song ended, Emberwing settled down, its breathing becoming steady and calm. Seraphine finally spoke and asked Jake why he had come. Jake admitted he could not sleep and that he had questions. Seraphine smiled and said she had expected as much. She asked him what he wanted to know. Jake asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the canyon. He asked why she and her dragon had been prisoners of her own people. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, her violet eyes distant. Then she began to speak, and Jake listened as she told him about a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the Ashenvale Dominion, about evidence of deliberate warmongering, about her attempt to expose the truth. As she spoke, Jake realized that Maya had been wrong. They had not captured someone valuable. They had captured someone who might change the entire war. And standing there in the dim detention cell, listening to this mysterious alien noblewoman reveal secrets that could reshape two civilizations, Jake Morrison felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Seraphine finished her story and asked Jake the same question she had posed in the canyon. She asked why he saved those who were not his own. This time, Jake had an answer. He said that maybe that was what made humans different. Maybe that was why the Ashenvale were so afraid of humanity. Because humans kept insisting that everyone could be their own if given the chance. Seraphine stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something that shocked him. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. She said that perhaps she had chosen the right human to capture her after all. Jake left the detention level more confused than ever, but also strangely hopeful. Behind him, Seraphine returned to her singing, and Emberwing's golden eyes tracked the human commander's departure with an intelligence that seemed far too knowing. The valiant dawn hummed with rumors and speculation. Word had spread quickly that Commander Morrison had brought back an Ashenvale noblewoman and her dragon. Some crew members were excited about the intelligence possibilities. Others worried it was a trap. Everyone had opinions, but no one had answers. Captain Lisa Monroe certainly wanted answers. She cornered Jake in the command center 3 days after the capture and demanded to know why the prisoner would only speak to him. Jake admitted he did not understand it either, but Seraphine had refused to talk to anyone else. Lisa was not satisfied with that response. She reminded Jake that she was the intelligence officer on this ship and that interrogating prisoners was her job. Jake agreed, but pointed out that forcing the issue would only make Seraphine shut down completely. Lisa glared at him, but finally gave permission for Jake to continue as the primary contact. Jake found himself spending hours in the detention level. At first, he told himself it was purely for intelligence gathering. Seraphine had information about Ashenvale fleet movements, political structures, and military capabilities. Each conversation revealed something new and valuable. But as the days passed, Jake realized the conversations had become something more. Seraphine was brilliant, with a tactical mind that matched his own. She spoke about honor and duty in ways that resonated deeply with his own beliefs. She also had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard. One evening, as Jake reviewed star charts with her through the cell barrier, Seraphine asked him about human culture. She said that Ashenvale children were taught that humans were violent barbarians who destroyed everything they touched. She wondered how much of that was true. Jake considered the question carefully. He admitted that humans could be violent and destructive, but they could also be compassionate and creative. He said that humanity's greatest strength was also its greatest flaw, which was that humans never accepted that something was impossible. They always believed things could be better. Seraphine listened intently and then shared something in return. She explained that Ashenvale society was dying slowly. Their birth rates had been declining for centuries. Their dragons were bonding less frequently with new riders. The old families were losing their power and influence. The Dominion was a fading empire desperately clinging to past glory. She said that was why the extremists in the High Council feared humanity so much. Humans represented everything the Ashenvale were losing: youth, vitality, rapid advancement, and endless optimism. The extremists believed that if they did not destroy humanity now, humans would eventually replace them as the dominant force in this region of space. Jake was stunned by this revelation. He asked if that was the truth she had tried to expose. Seraphine nodded and said it was part of it. The full truth was worse. She explained that she had been the youngest fleet commander in Ashenvale history. During a campaign near the neutral zone, she captured human intelligence files that contained something shocking. The files showed that many of the recent attacks attributed to human aggression had actually been false flag operations conducted by Ashenvale extremists. The war had not started because of natural conflict between expanding civilizations. It had been engineered deliberately by High Archon Velithar and his faction. They wanted a war that would unite the Ashenvale Dominion against a common enemy and distract from internal problems. When Seraphine brought this evidence to her superiors, she expected justice. Instead, she was arrested for treason. Her own uncle, Lord Castian Vel Ashara, had been forced to denounce her to protect their house. She was sentenced to execution by dragonfire, which was the most shameful death possible for her people. Jake listened to all of this in growing anger. He asked why the moderates in the Ashenvale government allowed this to happen. Seraphine explained that Velithar controlled the military and had supporters throughout the nobility. Anyone who opposed him too openly met with accidents. The moderates wanted peace, but were too afraid to act. Before Jake could respond, alarms blared throughout the ship. His comm erupted with urgent messages. Ashenvale forces had found the Valiant Dawn and were attacking in overwhelming numbers. Jake ran for the command center, but Lisa's voice stopped him through the comm. She told him that the assault was specifically targeting the detention level. They were trying to kill Seraphine before she could share what she knew. Jake reversed direction and sprinted back toward the detention area. He arrived to find guards fighting desperately against breaching charges on the outer hull. Plasma fire lit up the corridors. It was chaos. He reached Seraphine's cell and made a split-second decision. He overrode the security locks and opened her cell door. Seraphine stared at him in shock and asked what he was doing. Jake told her that the choice was hers, but if she wanted to live and if she wanted to stop this war, she needed to fight alongside him right now. Seraphine held his gaze for a long moment. Then she moved to Emberwing's cell and placed her hand on the barrier. She spoke to the dragon in their own language, and Jake felt the air itself seem to respond. The bond between rider and dragon was more than just emotional. It was something mystical that humans did not fully understand. The barrier opened, and Emberwing emerged, now mostly healed from the injuries. The dragon was magnificent, its scales gleaming like molten metal. It looked at Jake with those intelligent golden eyes, and Jake had the distinct impression he was being measured and judged. Seraphine mounted Emberwing with fluid grace and extended a hand to Jake. She told him to hold on and trust her. Jake took her hand and pulled himself up behind her on the dragon's back. He had barely settled when Emberwing launched forward through the corridors. What followed was the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of Jake's life. Emberwing moved through the ship with impossible speed and precision. When they reached the breach point, Ashenvale soldiers were pouring through. They froze in shock when they saw Lady Seraphine riding her dragon toward them. Seraphine shouted commands in her own language. Most of the Ashenvale soldiers hesitated, unwilling to fire on a noblewoman and her dragon, but the officers pushed them forward, screaming that she was a traitor. Emberwing unleashed a torrent of fire that turned the breach point into an inferno. The Ashenvale forces retreated in chaos. Human soldiers rallied behind the dragon, pushing the attackers back. Within minutes, the breach was sealed and the assault was over. Jake slid off Emberwing's back, his heart pounding. Around him, human crew members stared in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. An enemy noblewoman had just saved their ship. Admiral Stevens arrived with a security detail, her weapon drawn and aimed at Seraphine. The admiral demanded to know whose side the prisoner was really on. The corridor fell silent as everyone waited for the answer. Seraphine dismounted from Emberwing with dignity despite her prisoner clothing and injuries. She looked Admiral Stevens directly in the eye and said that she was on the side of truth and justice. She said that High Archon Velithar and his extremists were criminals who had corrupted the Dominion and engineered this war. She said that if the humans would allow it, she would testify to everything she knew before any authority they chose. She said she would betray her own government to end the bloodshed because her true loyalty was to her people, not to the corrupt leaders who were leading them to destruction. And if that made her a traitor in the eyes of the Dominion, then she would wear that title with pride. The Admiral studied Seraphine for a long, tense moment. Then she slowly lowered her weapon and told Jake to take the prisoner to medical for evaluation. As guards moved to escort them, Stevens added one more thing. She said that the political situation had just become incredibly complicated, but that they might finally have a path to ending this war. In the medical bay, Maya treated Seraphine's injuries while Jake stood guard. Maya worked in silence for a while before finally speaking. She said she had been wrong about Seraphine and admitted that the Ashenvale woman had just saved dozens of human lives. Seraphine, her voice tired but calm, said that she had saved Ashenvale lives too. The soldiers who had attacked were following orders from corrupt leaders. They deserved better than to die for a lie. Jake found himself smiling despite the situation. He told Seraphine that she was either the bravest person he had ever met or the most foolish. Seraphine smiled back and replied that in her experience, there was not much difference between the two. Later that night, Jake sat in his quarters reviewing the day's events. His door chimed and Admiral Stevens entered without waiting for permission. She told him that Fleet Command had been informed of the situation and wanted Seraphine brought to a neutral world for a summit. If her information was accurate, they might be able to present it to moderate Ashenvale houses and forge a peace treaty. Jake asked what would happen to Seraphine afterward. Stevens was quiet before answering. She said that depended on many things, but that Seraphine had burned all her bridges with the Dominion. She would never be able to return home safely. Jake thought about that, about what Seraphine had given up. She had sacrificed everything, her position, her family, her entire future, because she believed it was the right thing to do. He wondered if he would have the courage to make that same choice, if their positions were reversed. The next morning, Jake went to see Seraphine in her new quarters. She was no longer in a cell, but rather in supervised guest accommodations. Emberwing was being housed in a modified cargo bay nearby. When Jake entered, he found Seraphine standing by the window, looking out at the stars. She spoke without turning and said that she had never expected to see those stars from a human ship. She had expected to die in chains, her name erased from history, her truth buried with her. Jake had changed all of that. Jake moved to stand beside her at the window. He said that she had changed things too, that her courage had given both their peoples a chance at peace. Seraphine finally looked at him and said that courage was easier when you had someone who believed in you. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars drift past, neither of them fully aware yet of how much their fates had become intertwined or the challenges that still awaited them. The diplomatic world of Concordia shimmered in the viewport like a jewel. Jake had never seen anything quite like it. The entire planet was dedicated to neutral ground meetings between the various powers of this sector. Ancient treaties protected it from warfare, and both humans and Ashenvale respected those treaties. Seraphine stood beside him, wearing formal Ashenvale robes that Admiral Stevens had somehow acquired. She looked every bit the noblewoman she was born to be, elegant and commanding. But Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. The journey to Concordia had taken 2 weeks, and during that time, Jake and Seraphine had grown closer. They spent hours discussing strategy for the upcoming summit, but they also talked about other things. She told him about growing up in one of the ancient houses, about the pressure of expectations and the loneliness of command. He told her about Earth, about human history, about his own journey from a small farming colony to Fleet Command. One night, somewhere in deep space between stars, Seraphine had asked Jake what he would do after the war ended. Jake admitted he had never really thought about it because he had never truly believed the war would end. Seraphine had touched his hand gently and said that was the saddest thing she had ever heard, that everyone deserved to dream of peace. Now, as their shuttle descended toward Concordia's grand diplomatic complex, those dreams felt tantalizingly close and yet impossibly far away. Maya sat across from them, her face serious. She had been assigned to the delegation as medical officer, but everyone knew she was really there as security. If something went wrong, Maya would get Jake and Seraphine out. The summit hall was breathtaking. Carved from white stone and decorated with symbols from dozens of different civilizations, it represented centuries of diplomatic effort. Hundreds of beings filled the seats, human and Ashenvale delegations sitting on opposite sides with neutral observers in between. Jake escorted Seraphine to the central speaking platform. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room following them. The whispers started immediately. Many Ashenvale had heard rumors of a traitor noblewoman, but seeing Lady Seraphine Vel Ashara in person, standing beside a human officer, was shocking. Admiral Stevens began the proceedings with a formal introduction. She explained that Lady Seraphine had evidence of criminal conspiracy within the Ashenvale High Council, evidence that proved this war had been engineered for political purposes. She called on all present to listen with open minds. An Ashenvale elder from House Meridian objected immediately. He declared that nothing a known traitor said could be trusted. Others joined the protest, their voices rising in anger. For a moment, Jake thought the summit would collapse before it even started. Then Seraphine spoke, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. She said that she understood their anger and their doubt. She said that she had been taught from childhood that loyalty to the Dominion was the highest virtue, but she had learned that blind loyalty to corrupt leaders was not virtue at all. It was cowardice. The hall fell silent. Seraphine continued, presenting her evidence piece by piece. She showed intercepted communications between High Archon Velithar and his co-conspirators. She revealed financial records proving that extremist factions had funded attacks on both Ashenvale and human targets. She provided testimony from other dissidents who had been silenced or disappeared. The evidence was damning. Jake watched the faces in the crowd shift from skepticism to shock to outrage. Even the hardline Ashenvale delegates seemed shaken. The moderate houses were particularly vocal in their anger, demanding explanations and investigations. A human senator stood and proposed that immediate peace talks begin while the accusations were investigated. An Ashenvale diplomat from House Celestia seconded the proposal. It seemed impossible, but peace was actually within reach. Then everything changed. A massive holographic projection appeared at the center of the hall, larger than life. High Archon Velithar himself, his face cold and arrogant, looked down at the assembled delegates. He must have been monitoring the proceedings somehow. Velithar spoke with contempt, dripping from every word. He said that Seraphine's evidence was fabricated, manufactured by human intelligence to sow discord. He said that she was a traitor who had been seduced by human lies. He demanded that she be immediately arrested and returned to the Dominion for execution. Seraphine faced the projection without flinching. She told Velithar that history would judge which of them was the true traitor. Velithar laughed and said that history was written by the victors, and the Dominion would ensure that humans never lived long enough to write anything. The threat was clear. The moderates might want peace, but Velithar was declaring his intention to continue the war regardless. The hall erupted into chaos. Delegates were shouting, some calling for war, others for peace, everyone talking over each other. Jake saw Seraphine's hands trembling. She had risked everything for this moment, and it was slipping away. The extremists were too powerful, too entrenched. Evidence was not enough. They needed something more, something that would force change. Seraphine seemed to reach the same conclusion. She walked across the platform, past the human delegation, directly to where Jake stood. The hall quieted as everyone watched her move with purpose and grace. She stopped in front of him, her violet eyes meeting his. In a voice that carried through the entire hall, amplified by the chamber's acoustics, Seraphine spoke words that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. She said that if only he were her husband, they could unite their worlds and end this madness forever. The silence that followed was absolute. Jake felt his mind go blank with shock. He understood enough about Ashenvale culture to know what those words meant. Seraphine had just made a formal marriage proposal in front of hundreds of witnesses. In her culture, such a declaration was legally binding if accepted. From a first-blood noblewoman to an alien, it was revolutionary. He saw his own shock reflected in every face around him. Admiral Stevens looked like she might have a heart attack. The Ashenvale delegates were frozen in disbelief. Even Velithar's hologram seemed stunned into silence. Seraphine waited, her expression calm, but her eyes pleading. Jake realized that this was not just a political maneuver, though it was certainly that. She meant it. Somewhere during their weeks together, between conversations in detention cells and standing together against her own people, genuine feelings had developed. Jake found his voice and asked if she was certain. Seraphine smiled softly and said that she had never been more certain of anything in her life. She said that she had spent her entire life following rules and traditions that led only to decay and conflict. It was time to make a new tradition. The chamber exploded into noise. Delegates were shouting in a dozen languages. The hologram of Velithar vanished abruptly. Jake stood frozen in the center of chaos, his mind racing through the implications. Admiral Stevens pushed through the crowd and pulled Jake aside. She told him in urgent tones that this was not just a marriage proposal, that it was a strategic alliance wrapped in ceremony. If he accepted, it would legitimize human Ashenvale unions, force the moderate houses to acknowledge humanity as equals, and destroy the extremists' narrative of human inferiority. It would also make him and Seraphine the biggest targets in two civilizations. Maya appeared on his other side and said that maybe Seraphine was asking him because she actually cared about him, that not everything had to be about politics. Jake looked at his friend and realized Maya was right. This was about more than strategy. This was about two people who had found something genuine in the middle of war. An Ashenvale elder approached. It was Lord Castian Vel Ashara, Seraphine's uncle. His face was pale and his voice shook slightly. He told Jake that by the ancient laws of House Ashara, if Jake accepted, he would become part of their family. The political shockwave would tear through the Dominion. Many would see it as the ultimate betrayal, but others, especially the younger generation, might see it as hope for a different future. Jake asked for time to consider. Castian nodded and said that he had until sunset by Concordia's clock. The summit was suspended while everyone waited for Jake's answer. Jake found a quiet garden in the complex and sat alone, trying to think clearly. Seraphine found him there an hour later. She sat beside him without speaking, just her presence offering comfort. Finally, Jake asked her what she truly wanted, setting aside politics and strategy. Seraphine was quiet for a long time before answering. She said that in her culture, dragon riders bonded for life. When you found someone who understood your heart and shared your values, you did not let them go simply because it was complicated. She said that she had found that with him, in the strangest and most impossible circumstances. Jake thought about his own life, about years of fighting a war that seemed endless. He thought about Seraphine's courage in risking everything for truth. He thought about how much better the universe could be if more people made choices based on hope instead of fear. He told her that he needed to know one thing. If he accepted, would this be real, or would it just be a political arrangement? Seraphine took his hand and said that she would not have asked if she did not mean it. She said that her people had a saying, which was that the heart knows truth that the mind takes years to understand. Jake realized that his decision was already made. It had probably been made weeks ago when he chose to save Emberwing, or perhaps when he opened Seraphine's cell during the battle. Maybe some choices were inevitable once you started down a certain path. As the sun began to set over Concordia, Jake and Seraphine returned to the summit hall together. The delegates assembled quickly, tension thick in the air. Jake stood at the center platform and gave his answer. He accepted Seraphine's proposal with one condition. He said that this marriage would be real, not just political theater. If they were going to unite two species, they would do it with honesty and genuine commitment. Seraphine's smile was radiant. The hall erupted once more, but this time the sound was different. There was still shock and anger from some quarters, but there was also something else. There was excitement, curiosity, and hope. The formal ceremony was set to begin immediately according to Ashenvale tradition. But as attendants moved to prepare the ritual space, alarms began blaring throughout the complex. Screens lit up with emergency warnings. Velithar's forces were launching an assault on Concordia, violating centuries of diplomatic treaty. They were coming to stop the Union by force. Jake grabbed Seraphine's hand as chaos erupted around them. Admiral Stevens was already shouting orders, coordinating defensive positions. The battle for Concordia had begun, and with it, the battle for the future of two civilizations. Explosions rocked the diplomatic complex as Velithar's forces descended from orbit. Jake pulled Seraphine toward cover as debris rained down around them. The beautiful white stone of the summit hall cracked and crumbled under the assault. Centuries of peaceful tradition were being destroyed in minutes. Admiral Stevens was coordinating the evacuation of civilian delegates while calling for military reinforcements. But the nearest human fleet was hours away, and the moderate Ashenvale forces were scattered. Velithar had chosen his moment perfectly. If he could kill Seraphine and Jake before the marriage ceremony completed, he could claim the attack was justified to stop a traitor. Maya appeared through the smoke and chaos, dragging emergency equipment. She shouted that they needed to get Seraphine to safety immediately, but Seraphine refused to move. She said that running would accomplish nothing. Velithar would just chase them across the galaxy. They needed to complete the ceremony, and they needed to do it now. Jake stared at her in disbelief. He pointed out that completing a marriage ceremony in the middle of an active combat zone was insane. Seraphine smiled grimly and said that was exactly why it would work. Velithar expected them to run. Instead, they would show both their peoples that no amount of violence could stop those who chose hope over fear. An Ashenvale elder, Lord Castian, limped toward them through the rubble. He was bleeding from a wound on his arm, but his voice was steady. He said that Seraphine was right and that he would conduct the ceremony himself if they were willing. As the head of House Ashara, he had that authority. He said it would take less than 5 minutes. Admiral Stevens objected immediately. She said it was her duty to protect human interests and that allowing Jake to proceed was reckless. Jake looked at the Admiral and said that sometimes protecting human interests meant taking risks for something bigger than immediate safety. Stevens held his gaze for a long moment, then swore under her breath and ordered her troops to form a defensive perimeter around the ceremony site. What followed was the strangest wedding in human history. While plasma fire lit up the sky and explosions echoed through the complex, Lord Castian began the ancient Ashenvale binding ceremony. Delegates who had taken cover crept back to witness the impossible sight. Human soldiers and Ashenvale guards stood side by side, holding off the attackers. Castian spoke the ritual words in his own language, his voice rising above the sound of battle. Jake understood none of it, but Seraphine translated the important parts in whispers. The ceremony was about two souls choosing to become one, about loyalty that transcended blood and culture, about building something new from different foundations. Then came the part that required participation. Castian asked Jake if he accepted Seraphine as his partner in all things, in war and peace, in joy and sorrow, until death claimed them both. Jake said yes without hesitation. Seraphine was asked the same question. Her voice was clear and strong as she gave her answer. She said yes, not just to Jake, but to everything this choice represented. She was choosing humanity over the Dominion, hope over fear, love over tradition. But the ceremony required one more element. An Ashenvale marriage, especially for dragon riders, needed the blessing of the dragon. Emberwing was still in the cargo bay of a ship in orbit. Without the dragon, the ceremony could not be completed. Seraphine closed her eyes and reached out through the mystical bond she shared with Emberwing. Jake watched in amazement as she communicated across the distance, calling her dragon to her side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sky lit up with fire. Emberwing descended through the chaos of battle like a meteor. The dragon was magnificent and terrifying, its scales gleaming in the light of explosions, its wings spreading wider than any human aircraft. Velithar's forces scattered in panic as the dragon roared a challenge that shook the ground. Emberwing landed beside the ceremony site with surprising gentleness. The dragon's golden eyes fixed on Jake, and he felt the weight of that ancient intelligence studying him. This was the moment of judgment. If Emberwing rejected him, the ceremony would fail. More than that, Jake would likely be incinerated. Seraphine whispered for him to approach without fear and to show Emberwing his heart. Jake did not fully understand what that meant, but he stepped forward anyway. He reached out slowly and placed his hand on the dragon's scales. They were warm, almost hot to the touch, and he could feel power thrumming beneath them. Emberwing lowered its massive head until one golden eye was level with Jake's face. For a long moment, neither moved. Then something incredible happened. Jake felt a sensation like electricity running through his body. Images flashed through his mind, memories that were not his own. He saw Seraphine as a child, bonding with Emberwing for the first time. He saw battles and losses and moments of beauty. He saw Seraphine's pain when she was betrayed by her own people. And somehow, through that connection, Jake understood. The dragon was not just a mount or a weapon. Emberwing was Seraphine's truest friend, her partner in every sense that mattered. By accepting Jake, the dragon was giving permission for him to join that sacred bond. Emberwing made a sound, somewhere between a purr and a rumble. Lord Castian gasped and said that the dragon had accepted Jake. He said it was unprecedented, that no human had ever been accepted into a dragon bond before. He completed the ceremony with shaking hands, declaring Jake and Seraphine bound by law, custom, and the blessing of ancient power. The moment the ceremony ended, everything changed. Jake felt it like a physical shift. The bond with Emberwing was not as deep as Seraphine's, but it was real. He could sense the dragon's emotions, its fierce protectiveness, its approval of his courage. But there was no time to marvel at this development. Velithar's forces had regrouped and were launching a concentrated assault on their position. Admiral Stevens shouted that they could not hold much longer. They needed to evacuate immediately. Seraphine had a different idea. She told Jake to trust her and climbed onto Emberwing's back. She extended her hand to him, asking him to fight with her as they were meant to. Jake took her hand and pulled himself up. This time, being on the dragon felt different. He could feel the bond humming between the three of them. Seraphine gave Emberwing a command, and the dragon launched skyward. Jake held on as they climbed above the battlefield, gaining altitude and perspective. From up here, he could see the full scope of the assault. Velithar had committed a significant force, but they were scattered and disorganized. They had expected easy targets, not organized resistance. Through the bond, Jake found himself able to communicate with Seraphine in ways that went beyond words. He could share tactical observations, and she could translate them into commands for Emberwing. Together, they became a coordinated fighting unit that was far more effective than the sum of its parts. They dove into the enemy formations, Emberwing's fire driving Velithar's forces into defensive positions. Human fighters followed their lead, coordinating their attacks with the dragon. Ashenvale guards who had sided with the moderate houses joined the defense, inspired by the sight of Lady Seraphine fighting alongside humans. The battle raged for hours. Jake lost track of time in the chaos of combat. He just focused on the bond with Seraphine and Emberwing, on protecting the delegates and showing Velithar's forces that their attack had failed. Finally, as Concordia's sun began to set for the second time that day, the enemy forces retreated. They had failed to stop the marriage, and they had lost too many ships to continue the assault. As they fled back into orbit, human and Ashenvale ships arrived, the reinforcements finally reaching the battlefield. Emberwing landed back at the diplomatic complex, now scarred and damaged but still standing. Jake and Seraphine dismounted, exhausted but alive. Admiral Stevens approached with a grim expression. She reported that they had captured several enemy ships, including Velithar's flagship. The High Archon himself was in custody. The implications were staggering. With Velithar captured and the evidence of his crimes confirmed by the attack on Concordia, the moderate houses would have the power they needed to take control of the Dominion. The war might actually be over. Lord Castian approached them, his arm now properly bandaged. He said that news of the marriage and the battle was already spreading across both civilizations. The response was mixed. Some called it a betrayal of everything the Ashenvale stood for. Others, especially younger citizens, were calling it the beginning of a new era. Castian told Seraphine that she could never return to the Dominion as it had been. Too many would see her as a traitor. But he also said that she had likely saved their people from slow extinction. By showing that Ashenvale and humans could unite, she had opened possibilities that did not exist before. Seraphine asked about House Ashara. Castian smiled sadly and said that the house would survive this scandal. It had survived worse over the centuries. He said that he was proud of her, even if he could never say so publicly. She had chosen the harder path because it was right, and that was the truest mark of nobility. That night, as repair crews worked to restore the diplomatic complex, Jake and Seraphine stood together looking out at the stars. Maya had checked them both for injuries and declared them remarkably intact given everything they had been through. Admiral Stevens was in meetings with the moderate Ashenvale leaders, beginning the complex process of formal peace negotiations. Jake asked Seraphine if she regretted her choice. She turned to him and said that regret was impossible when you knew in your heart that you had done the right thing. She said that fear would have been easier, that running or hiding would have been safer. But safety was not the same as life. Jake agreed and said that humans had a saying about that. They said it was better to die standing than to live kneeling. Seraphine smiled and said that her people had a similar saying. She said that perhaps humans and Ashenvale were not so different after all. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the bond between them and with Emberwing creating a sense of connection that needed no words. Finally, Seraphine spoke again. She said that this was only the beginning, that the real work of building peace and unity would take years. There would be opposition, threats, and endless challenges. Jake took her hand and said that he was ready for all of it. She had shown him that impossible things could become real if you had the courage to try. Seraphine leaned against him and whispered that together they would make a future worth the risks they had taken. 1 year had passed since the Battle of Concordia, and the galaxy had changed in ways that still amazed Jake every morning when he woke. The war had ended within weeks of Velithar's capture, once the moderate Ashenvale houses gained control and opened genuine peace negotiations. But ending the war had been the easy part. Building something new from the ashes was far more difficult. Jake stood on the observation deck of Horizon Station, the first joint human Ashenvale colony vessel. The ship was enormous, capable of carrying 10,000 settlers to establish a new world where both species would live together from the beginning. It was a bold experiment, and many on both sides predicted it would fail within months. Seraphine joined him at the viewport, their daughter cradled in her arms. Little Elena was 3 months old, and she represented something unprecedented. The first human Ashenvale hybrid child, proof that their species were compatible in ways that scientists were still struggling to understand. Elena had her mother's violet eyes, but her father's human features, a perfect blend of two worlds. Maya approached with her usual efficiency, carrying data pads filled with last-minute preparations. She had accepted a position as chief medical officer for the colony, saying that someone needed to keep Jake and Seraphine from getting themselves killed. The truth was that Maya believed in what they were building, even if she showed it through sarcasm and practical concern. Admiral Stevens appeared on the view screen, calling from fleet headquarters. She informed them that the launch ceremony was ready to begin and that dignitaries from both civilizations were assembled. She added, with a rare smile, that Jake had come a long way from the commander, who had captured an enemy noblewoman in a canyon raid. Jake returned the smile and said that he had help along the way. The launch ceremony was broadcast across both human and Ashenvale space. Jake and Seraphine stood together on the bridge, Elena sleeping peacefully between them. Jake gave a speech that had been written and rewritten dozens of times. He talked about courage, hope, and the power of choosing to build rather than destroy. But it was Seraphine who spoke the words that would be remembered. She said that a year ago she had been a prisoner facing execution, her faith in her own people shattered. One human had shown her kindness when he had every reason to show cruelty. That single act of compassion had changed the course of history. She said that was the true power of humanity, not their weapons or their technology, but their stubborn insistence that everyone deserved a chance at something better. She said that the Ashenvale had been a dying civilization, clinging to old glories and old hatreds. But humans had shown them that new beginnings were possible at any age. The colony ship represented more than just exploration. It represented a choice to embrace change rather than fear it. As she spoke, Emberwing flew alongside the ship, the dragon's form visible through the viewport. The sight of the ancient creature escorting a vessel of peace and hope was powerful symbolism that both species understood. Other dragons had begun bonding with human riders in recent months, something that had been considered impossible before Jake. After the ceremony, Jake found a quiet moment in their quarters. He reviewed reports from the Colony Selection Committee. The settlers were a mix of volunteers from both species, carefully chosen for their skills and their commitment to cooperation. There were farmers, engineers, teachers, artists, and dreamers. Each one had their own reasons for joining, but they all shared a belief that this experiment mattered. Lisa had also joined the colony mission as chief of security. She entered Jake's office without knocking, a habit she had never broken. She reported that intelligence suggested extremist factions on both sides were planning to disrupt the colony. Nothing concrete yet, but enough chatter to be concerning. Jake thanked her for the warning and said they would remain vigilant. Lisa hesitated before leaving and then spoke more personally. She said that when Jake had first brought Seraphine aboard the Valiant Dawn, Lisa had thought he was making a terrible mistake. She admitted that she had been wrong and that what Jake and Seraphine had built together was the most important thing any of them would ever be part of. That evening, Jake and Seraphine walked through the colony ship with Elena. The corridors were filled with families preparing for the journey ahead. Human children played with Ashenvale children, already forming friendships that would shape the next generation. Couples from both species talked excitedly about building homes on a new world. The atmosphere was electric with possibility. They passed the dragon stables, where Emberwing rested alongside 3 other bonded dragons. The younger dragons were still adjusting to having human partners, but the bonds were forming. Jake stopped to check on a young pilot named Sarah who had recently bonded with a dragon named Skyfire. Sarah was nervous, but excited, saying that the bond felt like gaining a part of herself she had not known was missing. Seraphine smiled and told Sarah that was exactly right. She said the bond would grow stronger with time and trust. She also warned that bonding came with responsibilities. Dragons were not pets or tools. They were partners who deserved respect and care. Sarah nodded seriously, clearly understanding the weight of what she had accepted. As they continued their walk, Seraphine spoke quietly to Jake about her uncle. Lord Castian had sent a private message congratulating them on Elena's birth. He said that House Ashara officially had no comment on the colony mission, but privately he wished them success. He also warned that not all the old houses were accepting change gracefully. Some still saw the human Ashenvale unions as an abomination that should be stopped by any means necessary. Jake acknowledged the danger but said they had always known this would not be easy. Change never was, but that was not a reason to stop trying. Seraphine agreed and pointed out that they had survived Velithar's assault, political conspiracies, and countless threats. They would survive whatever came next. The next morning, Horizon Station began its journey. The massive colony ship accelerated smoothly, escorted by both human and Ashenvale vessels. The destination was a world designated as New Haven, a planet with conditions suitable for both species. The journey would take 3 months, and during that time the colonists would prepare for the challenges ahead. Jake spent his days coordinating with department heads and his nights with his family. Elena was growing quickly, already showing signs of the hybrid vigor that scientists found fascinating. She responded to both human and Ashenvale communication styles. Sometimes Jake caught Seraphine singing to their daughter in the ancient language of her people, lullabies that had been passed down through generations. One night, about halfway through the journey, Jake could not sleep. He went to the observation deck and found he was not alone. An elderly Ashenvale scholar named Alara stood gazing at the stars. She had joined the colony to study the formation of a new hybrid culture. When she noticed Jake, she invited him to join her. Alara spoke about her studies and her observations. She said that what was happening on this ship was unprecedented in galactic history. 2 species that had been at war were not just making peace, but actively choosing to merge their futures. The children being born would be neither fully human nor fully Ashenvale, but something new. She said it was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Jake asked if she thought it would work. Alara considered the question carefully. She said that the odds were not favorable, that the cultural differences were enormous, that prejudices on both sides ran deep. But she also said that she had watched human and Ashenvale parents comfort each other's children during the journey. She had seen mixed couples forming despite every social pressure against it. She had witnessed Emberwing accept Jake into a bond that her people had believed was impossible. She said that sometimes the most important things were also the most improbable. That was what made them worth fighting for. The ship reached New Haven without major incident. The planet was beautiful, with vast forests and clear oceans. The atmosphere was breathable for both species, and preliminary scans showed abundant resources. It was perfect for their purposes. The landing was carefully coordinated. Human and Ashenvale engineers worked side by side to establish the first settlement. Prefabricated buildings went up quickly, forming the core of what would become New Haven City. Fields were marked out for farming. Schools and medical facilities were prioritized. Everyone had tasks, and everyone contributed. Jake and Seraphine stood at the center of the settlement site, watching the organized chaos of construction. Elena, now 4 months old, looked around with wide eyes at her new home world. Emberwings circled overhead, the dragon's presence a reminder that ancient power could protect new beginnings. Admiral Stevens contacted them from orbit, saying that the fleet would remain in system for another week before returning to their regular duties. She said that the galaxy was watching this experiment closely. Success here could open the door to more colonies, more cooperation, and eventually full integration of the two civilizations. Failure could set back human-Ashenvale relations by decades. Jake acknowledged the pressure but said that they were not doing this for political reasons anymore. They were doing it because it was right, because every person on this planet deserved a chance to live without the shadow of old hatreds. That was reason enough. Over the following weeks, the settlement grew. The first crops were planted. The first children started classes in the new school. The first couples from different species held formal bonding ceremonies. There were challenges and conflicts, moments when cultural misunderstandings threatened to tear the community apart. But each time, people chose understanding over anger, communication over conflict. 6 months after landing, Jake stood with Seraphine at the dedication of the colony memorial. It was a simple structure, honoring those who had died in the war and those who had sacrificed everything to build peace. Names from both species were carved into stone, human and Ashenvale together. No longer enemies, but fellow travelers on a difficult journey. Seraphine placed her hand on the memorial and spoke softly. She said that her people had a tradition of speaking to the dead, asking for their guidance. She wondered what those who had fallen would think of this place, of the future being built on the foundation of their sacrifice. Jake said that he thought they would be proud, not because everything was perfect, but because people were trying. They were choosing hope over fear, love over hate, tomorrow over yesterday. That was all anyone could ask. As the sun set on New Haven, painting the sky in colors that neither Earth nor the Ashenvale homeworld had ever shown, Jake and Seraphine walked back to their home with Elena. Emberwing landed nearby, settling down to rest. Other families, human and Ashenvale, did the same, ending their day in the simple routine of domestic life. Later that night, with Elena sleeping peacefully in her crib, Seraphine asked Jake if he ever regretted accepting her proposal that day in the summit hall. Jake pulled her close and said that regret was impossible when you looked at what they had created together. He said that she had changed his life in every way that mattered, and he would make the same choice again without hesitation. Seraphine smiled and said that she felt the same. She said that a year ago she had declared before hundreds of witnesses that if only he were her husband, they could unite their worlds. Now, he was her husband, and they were doing exactly that. Not just through political treaties or military alliances, but through the daily acts of people choosing to live together, work together, and build a future together. Outside their window, the lights of New Haven City glowed against the darkness. Human ships and Ashenvale dragons patrolled the skies in perfect coordination. Children of both species, and increasingly children of both heritages, dreamed of tomorrow. The experiment was working, not because it was easy, but because enough people believed it was worth the effort. Jake thought back to that night in the canyon, when he had made the choice to save an enemy noblewoman and her dragon. That single decision had led to everything that followed. It had led to friendship, to love, to war and peace, and finally, to this moment. Standing in a home on an alien world, with a family that represented the impossible made real. The war had ended not with surrender, but with a promise, and humanity had proven once again that its greatest strength was not in weapons or tactics, but in the stubborn belief that even the impossible could be made real. And as Jake held his wife and listened to their daughter breathing softly, he knew that the best part of the impossible was still ahead of them, waiting to be written by those brave enough to try.